Thank you very much, Chairman Paul and Ranking Member Peters. I very much appreciate your willingness to let me sit in with this subcommittee as you're holding this hearing. Thank you to all of the witnesses. As you could tell from my colleague from New Hampshire, Senator Hassan, and as many of you already know, this is a huge issue for us in New Hampshire. And I would like to actually begin with you, Dr. Cravat, because I think Senator Peters referenced the report that we learned that ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, had delayed that indicated the impact of the minimum risk levels for PFOA and PFAS should be 10 times lower than what the agency had previously determined. So, Dr. Cravat, based on those findings, is the EPA considering updating the lifetime health advisories for those chemicals?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you also for your support of our work in New Hampshire. So we are very close collaborators with ATSDR. We work with them on their tox profile, and they're actually working with us right now on toxicity assessments we're doing on additional compounds, PFBS and Gen X, as is Dr. Birnbaum and folks at NIEHS. And at Department of Defense. We are not planning currently to update our drinking water health advisories for PFOA and PFAS. We recognize, as does ATSDR, that the purposes of their toxicity profile differ from our health advisories. Theirs is really focused on a screening approach, and that's part of the reason why they have lower values than we have. And we believe that our health advisories are supported by the strongest science, and we also appreciate why they took the direction they did in their toxicity profiles.
So as you're working with them, do you have any kind of timetable whereby you expect to definitively determine whether the levels make sense going forward? Or are you telling me that based on the science, you believe that you have set the correct levels for human health?
Yes, based on the current science, we believe that the health advisory value that we've developed is supported, and we subjected that to independent external peer review, and we believe that the findings were supported. But in saying so, I'm not trying in any way to discount the importance of ATSDR's toxicity profile, but really to recognize that the purposes of their profile differ somewhat. It's really a screening tool. So if levels are found above the values they've established, that's an indicator of the need for additional investigation, as opposed to our drinking water health advisories are really trying to identify a level below which we believe it's safe and above which we believe that action should be taken. And in fact, that's the way the drinking water health advisory has been used around the country.
And so are you going to be paying attention to the health study that they currently have underway? And will the outcome of that have any impact on whether you decide to change the levels that you're recommending?
We'll be paying very careful attention to that work, as we're paying very careful attention to the work that Dr. Birnbaum has underway at NIHS and other research organizations as well. And as the science continues to develop, we will look back at this issue and make sure that we continue to have a value that reflects the best science. That's our commitment.
I think there's a great deal of concern among people in New Hampshire who have been affected by these chemicals that we really don't know enough yet about the science to be able to make definitive determinations, and that's why the health study is so important. Dr. Birnbaum, in July, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued a report that said New Hampshire had, for the period of time between 2003 and 2014, the highest rates of pediatric cancer in the country. There is a cluster of pediatric cancer in the seacoast, close to where we have seen those elevated levels of PFAS chemicals from the closure of Pease Air Force Base. And I wonder if you could describe the work that you're doing at NIEHS to connect PFAS exposure to cancer and how you're working with ATSDR as they're looking at this health study.
So thank you for your question. Thank you, Senator Shaheen. We are working very closely with and providing consultation to ATSDR related to the funding that they have gotten through the Department of Defense to deal with 8 sites at different places in the country. Those stages, the studies are initially going to be looking at exposure so that we really know what people are exposed to at those sites, and then the health effects parts will come later. So we're looking at quite a number of years before we'll have a lot of data from those studies. At the same point, we have...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you be a little more specific when you say quite a number of years? Are you talking about 5 years, 10 years, 20 years?
I would say we're looking at a 5-year window. Would be realistic. I mean, these are very difficult studies to conduct, and especially when you're dealing with people living on or around military bases, there's a lot of movement, so it's sometimes hard to track people. We have many of our grantees are actually looking at the relationship between this class of chemicals and different kinds of cancer. So far, there are associations that have been reported by our grantees and others that have shown associations with a wide variety of cancers. In fact, a very wide variety of cancers. We're not talking about just one type, but we have not seen an increase in pediatric cancers in the studies that have been conducted to date. That may in part be because the question has not yet been asked. So I think that there's an opportunity to investigate this, this elevated rate that appears to be, especially in a specific region of New Hampshire. And we would welcome grants in that area.
I'm not quite clear when you say because the question hasn't been asked. What exactly do you mean by that?
When people design, say, whether it's an animal study or a human study, people usually have a hypothesis that they are testing. And most of the animal studies, which provide the biological plausibility to say what we might see in an epidemiology study makes sense, have focused on adult animals, not developing animals.
Well, as you all know, there were 2 child care centers that were located on Pease where children drank that water almost from birth. So I hope that that question will be asked as part of the study. Thank you all very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm out of time, but I have a statement here from the Merrimack Citizens for Clean Water as well as the Commissioner of our Department of Environmental Services in New Hampshire that I would like to ask be introduced for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. This is for Dr. Gravatt, and I know that the EPA has been working very hard to try and help address the contamination, but it's been nearly 10 years since EPA established provisional health advisories for PFOA and PFAS. Why, after 10 years, hasn't the EPA come up with an enforceable drinking standard for PFOAs and other PFAS chemicals?
Thank you very much for the important question. And there are 3 criteria in the Safe Drinking Water Act that guide this decision on whether to develop an enforceable standard. The first is whether a contaminant has an impact on the health of persons, and I think we've discussed that issue extensively here. Right. The second is whether that contaminant occurs at a frequency and level of concern in the nation's drinking water systems. And the third is, in the sole judgment of the administrator, there's a meaningful opportunity to reduce public health risk through a national drinking water regulation. And it's really those last 2 criteria that are the ones that the administrator is thinking about very carefully now. When we did our national survey of the nation's drinking water systems for these compounds, we sampled nearly 5,000 systems. It was a census of every large drinking water system in the United States and a representative sample of the smaller ones. It covered 80% of the United States population that's served by community water systems. And we found in that effort 1.3%, or 63 of the nation's systems, had levels of these PFOA and PFAS above our health advisory values. And additional work in the state of Michigan that's underway right now, a comprehensive sample of all the drinking water systems in the state of Michigan, results for about 750 drinking water systems have come back as a part of that effort. And thus far, 1, Parchment, has come back above the health advisory levels. And so these are important considerations about what is the most effective tool to make sure that we can protect local citizens from contamination in drinking water? Is it a national standard that requires all the nation's systems to sample on some regular basis and has the tools to get treatment in place, or is it something that will address more locally? And those are the issues that the administrator is thinking through. I'm not trying to signal a direction on that, but just to say these are important questions that Acting Administrator Wheeler is thinking about, and we will be including this in the National Management Plan that we hope to have done at the end of the calendar year.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Peters. And again, I very much appreciate being able to be part of this very important hearing on an issue that, as we've heard from the first panel, and you all clearly can confirm, this is an issue that affects tens of millions of people across the country. The cost of cleanup to address this is tens of billions of dollars. And we don't even know yet what the long-term health impacts are. So we have a lot of work to do. And I want to begin with you, Mrs. Amico. Thank you for all of your advocacy and for the group that you started. We affectionately call you all the Peas Moms because of all of the work that you've done to make sure that something was done at the local, state, and federal level to address the contamination that has affected you and your family and so many people. And I want to follow up on Senator Hassan's question about what we can do. You laid out some very impressive recommendations for what we ought to be thinking about as we're addressing this issue. If you could ask Congress to do one thing in the immediate term, what would it be?
Thank you for the question. I would say our top priority would be to stop the ongoing exposure. So we would need to strictly regulate PFAS as an entire class to a much lower standard than what we have right now to prevent ongoing exposure. That would be top priority, stop the exposure.
Clearly, prevention makes a lot more sense than cleanup later on. I want to ask you, Mr. Lurish, because it's my understanding that you and Andrea have worked together with other groups across the country to raise concern about this. Can you talk about how you've done that, how you all have worked together?
Thank you for the question, Senator Shaheen. What hasn't come out yet is my birth state was New Hampshire. I lived there for
See, I knew you looked
60 years.
familiar.
I'm surprised you didn't pick up on the accent.
Both of us, yes.
But your question, if you could repeat just a quick thing?
I'm interested because we've obviously
how we
got
work together. I'm
people
sorry.
in the audience who
Yes.
have been affected by this across the country. And
Right.
I know from talking to Andrea that one of the things you all have done very effectively is network with groups across the country to see how you could advocate and build on what you're learning in different parts of the United States. So can you
Yes.
talk about some of the things that you've done?
Thank you. When I first started realizing the significance in Oscoda, I started to see that there was a process where the Air Force would bring the community in, and it's called the Restoration Advisory Board. So I went back home, and I attended the RAB at Pease, and I linked up with some of the program managers for remediation there from my old agency. So that's where I first started, and I met Elena there. I did not meet Andrea until today, actually, face-to-face, but I had talked to her and plus other groups. And I think that that's where the community, such as myself, community members, need to do, is we have to become educated on how the federal agencies do their business. Because if we don't, then we're just listening. We're not able to act and be activists until we understand what motivates them and what regulations do they have. So that was the first exposure, and the energy that these three ladies and others have done their business over the last 4.5 years is outstanding. So that is where we gain the knowledge, and I would suggest that all communities, at least around Department of Defense sites, that they do that. They engage with this group, the PFAS National Coalition. that holds calls, and that's where I've learned a lot about what is going on. And so we can use all of our expertise to bear on the large agencies that may not be acting as fast as we need.
Right. And let me just say how effective you have all been, because when I introduced the amendment in the Defense Authorization Bill 2 years ago for the health study, and we went around and talked to people on the committee from all over the country, there were a significant number of them who had heard from their constituents that this was an issue in their communities and in their states. So it has made a huge difference, and that advocacy is going to continue to make a difference as we go forward. I just want to ask a final question of you, Mr. Putnam, because one of the things that Congress did this summer was to pass the firefighters' cancer registry. Talk about why that's so important, especially as we think about an issue like this.
Thank you for the question. As we move forward, firefighters have a 60% more likely chance to get cancer. This is going to give us a basis to lead and help the IFF lead this drive to help find out what's causing it, whether it may be the PFAS or the environmental concerns that we deal with. This is going to drive that, and the cancer network is a big part of it also. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing.